So, does anybody know what this is a picture of? So, I'm a World War II geek, and you can tell by Inglourious Thread. How many people have seen Inglourious Bastards? So, fair amount of the room, right? It's a Quentin Tarantino movie, fictional scenario in World War II, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. But I travel a lot to the UK. Digital Shadows has an office in London, and in the spring I got to go to Bletchley for the first time. And it's one of the coolest places I've ever been. I'm not a SIGINT guy, but if you're SIGINT, even probably more so. So these are some pictures that I took from Bletchley. On the far right, does anybody know whose office that is? Yeah, Alan Turing's office. Hut 6 is the hut where what becomes GCHQ, essentially. We're doing Enigma decoding for the German Army and the German Air Force. Different huts have had different missions there. And then there's an intelligence report that came out of it. When I looked back, oftentimes, especially for those that do speaking a lot, you may write an abstract before you even really know what you're going to present about. So my abstract was very, very vague when I wrote this, and then I spent about 4 months reading books. And I was looking at the different intelligence services that were in World War II, and I thought, what lessons can we learn from World War II, lining back to our old school kind of tradecraft theme of the summit this year. And so these are some of the intel agencies in the European theater. I'm actually more interested in European theater than I am in the Pacific. But MI6, MI5, SOE was a competitor of MI6, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. They reported directly to Winston Churchill. On the Russian side, you had the NKGB and the NKVD, an internal and external intelligence organization. And then on the right, we had German units. Now, I am going to be talking about Germany in World War II, so I'm going to mention things that the Nazis did and things like that. In no way is this any kind of adoration of that, but I think there's important lessons to learn from that. But the SD was essentially the intelligence arm of the SS, and the SS was the very political group affiliated with Hitler and the party there. But there's a big difference in the country between that intelligence agency and OKW is what the bottom was the German military, traditional German military intelligence. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go on. There's a really, really good quote that Winston Churchill made the day, or a couple days after Operation Torch, which I'm going to lead into in a little bit as well. Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And I actually think that if we look back over the past 5 years of this summit, and a little bit longer, we've been doing the commercial private sector intelligence. I think this is a good place to sum us up. We have come a long way, let's say in the past 5 years of this particular event, but there is so much further that we need to go. And I think a lot of the talks that are going to focus on the next 2 days, tradecraft, analysis, old school thinking, really ties into this well. So I thought it was a really, really good quote. How many people know who Wild Bill Donovan is? So how many people know who General Patton is? A lot more hands in the air. Like, Patton is seen as a very high-profile figure, a lot of energy, very excitement. He is, Wild Bill Donovan is the equivalent on the intel side. He's basically the father of the modern CIA, and I would also say JSOC as well. Things that he was doing in World War II line up to those missions today quite closely. If you look at the state of U.S. intelligence in 1941, before we entered the war, primitive, parochial, underfunded, undermanned, and it was literally a dumping ground for terrible officers. You had an Army intelligence organization, you had a Navy intelligence organization, and then you had State Department. Very siloed, doing their own missions. There was nothing looking above, forest for the trees type of thing. And then introduce Wild Bill Donovan. He was a World War I infantry officer. He got a Medal of Honor. He was very much a lead from the front kind of guy. He actually went on the landings. And he didn't necessarily do the first waves of the landings in the Mediterranean, but he was going out front. So imagine the #1 spy master for the United States landing on beaches in Italy. Can you imagine if the enemy got a hold of this person and his knowledge, what that would have mean? Some would say it was quite careless. Another interesting story with him is at one point he had some friction with someone in, I can't remember if it was Burma, but it was in Asia, and they actually went out on a plane to a forward operating base. The two of them landed. The runway was too short. They couldn't necessarily take off, so it takes off in the air. They have to fly the plane sideways between two trees to get out. I mean, he almost died in this one-upmanship with this direct report of his that he had friction with. He's a very fascinating person. It'd be great to see a movie about him now. He had the ear of FDR, and he had this really great quote, and again, I think this really applies to today for us in threat intelligence. Information is useless unless it is intelligently directed to the strategic purpose. Again, if you look back over the past 5 years of us doing this event, or past 4 years, last year we started talking about strategic. Klopp had an idea last year that we frame it around tactical, operational, and strategic. We still have a very long way to go on the strategic purpose. I think that ties in well with the Churchill quote that I led with. So he wrote this letter to FDR, and he talked about the strategic purpose, something that was seeing across Army, Navy, State Department intelligence that was giving good information for leadership. And the Office of Strategic Services was formed. Originally, it was called COI, the Coordinator of Information, and reported directly to FDR. He did this proposal, and he ended up reporting to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and basically was able to save his agency, and they became the OSS. If he hadn't made that maneuvering, perhaps the OSS, which was disbanded after World War II and then became the CIA, maybe it wouldn't be where it is today if it wasn't for him going under the wing of JCS. Behind enemy lines here is a map from one of the CIA libraries although it doesn't really come out quite so well, some of these old screenshots that I have or documents don't come up quite so well, but basically they're marking OSS teams that are operating inside France, Jedburgh teams, which was another group out there, basically trying to stir up low-intensity conflict and insurrection, guerrilla warfare against the occupying Germans, and then the Vichy French in the south where that was occupied. This actually ties directly into Inglourious Bastards. They were an OSS team operating in France and Germany as well. Does anyone know who the OSS commander was in this movie? Here's some trivia for it. He's only on a phone call at the end of the movie when they're negotiating the surrender of Christopher, I forgot whatever that guy's last name is. It's Harvey Keitel. And Harvey Keitel has a tendency to pop up in Quentin Tarantino movies. So he's the OSS commander that makes the deal to have the German come over to the U.S. side, basically. Of course, if you've seen the movie, they leave him a little gift, but that was not appropriate to include in my slide deck. So like any Tarantino movie, my chronological timeline is going to be off. So now we're going to go to Operation Torch, which is actually before the Jedburgh teams and OSS was operating in France. Anyone know what Operation Torch is? So I'm such a geek. Before I had a password manager, all of my passwords were World War II code names. So Torch made up one of my very first passwords when I started having a thematic approach. But rest assured, now I don't have that. Now I have 30-character random passwords, all stored in one file as a single point of failure. So Operation Torch is pretty significant in World War II history. This is the Allied invasion of North Africa. It was also the first time that U.S. led the efforts there. British were involved as well, but they were very concerned about the Vichy French potentially fighting them, so they didn't want the Brits to be the lead or have any kind of publicity about it. At one point, it was even talked about the British troops wearing American uniforms. And this is very common today. We see that happening in downrange right now where people are wearing the locals' uniforms so that they don't stand out. This was a very, very important mission. It was very critical for the war efforts. And there was a number of high-level goals for it. One was to inspire guerrilla warfare campaigned against the French. This actually failed. They were able to leverage 12 State Department consuls, and of course, most people say they're State Department. That really means they're CIA these days. But it was essentially what they were doing back then. They had people in theater, and they were trying to raise this guerrilla warfare, and it wasn't quite successful. Another mission was they didn't want the French to fight the U.S. troops that were landing. They also failed here. There was about 5,000 people had their lives lost. So it was not an insignificant number. The problem that they had here was they had, imagine like brigade commander people that were down with not fighting, but they couldn't go up to the division level. They didn't have a high enough leader to be able to say, no, we're not going to fight. But what they did do a good job on, these 12 individuals, actually 13 with their leader, was give information on strengths, troop disposition, to help the Allies when they came in and did their landings. Another thing that they did quite well was give them landing conditions. And of course, for any Marines in the house, right, that practice amphibious assaults, know it's really important when you're going to land. They also were able to smuggle out natives in Morocco that helped guide the fleet that was landing through Straits of Gibraltar. So they had good success there. So they failed on 2 of the broader goals for the operation, but they were successful in 2. But going back to strategic purpose, this was seen as a huge success for OSS. It was the first time OSS was partnered with combat organizations. The strategic purpose of Operation Torch was to ultimately open up a second front, right? So they did have failure, but they were aligned and had success where it mattered. So the lesson here is if you and your organizations can determine what the strategic purpose of your group is, you may be an agency and it's attached to mission, you may be private sector and it's attached to revenue and profit and things like that, you may lose some battles, but overall you can have success if you're aligned to that strategic purpose. Operation Barbarossa. Does anyone know what this one is? So this is the German invasion of Russia, one of the biggest mistakes of many mistakes that Hitler made in the war. There was this, well, it's not any surprise that the Germans at the time, at least the Nazis, thought they were the greatest race on the planet, right? You can see all the atrocities that they did. They thought the Russians would just fold down and fight, and that was not the case. Couple lessons here is, one is avoid warfare in Russia in the winter. Hitler was very optimistic about their ability to take over Russia, the Ukraine, Moscow as well. And in fact, they were very, very successful when the Wehrmacht came in. A lot of quick wins, but then they made it to the winter and they had success. This one has nothing to do with the movie or the book, but I thought it was funny nonetheless. And if you don't get this joke, you really should watch The Princess Bride. I mean, I guess it kind of dates you a little bit, but great movie. Does anyone know who Admiral Wilhelm Canaris is? You can tell by the subtitle that he was the head of Abwehr. So he was the head of military intelligence in Germany. Very typically not involved in politics. They took a lot of pride in not being involved in politics. He was basically working against Hitler most of the time, Hitler's regime there. He hated Nazis. There was an intense competition trying to throw other people under the bus. The intelligence services, the SD and the Abwehr, they were fighting against each other. They were spying against each other. A significant amount. He's a very interesting person. He was a fluent Spanish speaker. He did a lot of work in South America. He had to actually escape from South America, and it's a very interesting tale. You could do a whole talk on him in general. He actually recommended against Operation Barbarossa, but he also gave some very bad intelligence on this. Hitler was one of his intelligence customers, right? And he had to provide some analysis for him. And the mistake that the Abwehr made in assessing Russia was they only looked at the traditional order of battle, their infantry divisions, their armor units. What they didn't take into account was all the paramilitary units that were in Russia and the pure amount of bodies that the Russians could just throw, like basically into a shredder, right? And that was part of the reason that the Germans got stuck getting in. But can you imagine trying to do intelligence briefings for someone like Hitler, right? Not necessarily the easiest. In fact, this decision to invade Russia was made without even telling the MI group for the German army. It was after the decision was made that they then had to come up with a plan, right? Versus providing an assessment in advance and saying this. It was all after the fact. The OSS, there's actually 2 studies done on Hitler during the war, and this is one that the OSS did, a professor did. Interesting thing about the OSS model, it was a net new organization. There were Hollywood actors, there were international businessmen, there were politicians. It really was a huge melting pot of individuals. It's actually a good lesson for us to learn, as people are building out their teams or complementing their teams, is don't just focus on people that come from the intelligence community. Don't just focus on people that have an incident response, very technical cyber background. Don't just focus on graduates out of King's College or something like that know traditional education. The more personalities you have in the mix, the better you will do. What I want to talk about now, and for those how many people here are vendors? selling in the cybersecurity side? Okay, and then how many people here are selling something to consumers? Their business is consumer focused. How many people are familiar with the concept of personas? So, now that I'm a year in, actually this week is a year in at Digital Shadows, and now I'm a Dirty Vendor, we use personas a lot, but I think the personas that are used in the marketing context can be applied to what we do here. Actually, at Forrester, our persona, his name was Sean Rhodes. He had a name, he had a picture. Sean Rhodes stood for security and risk. So at Forrester, we wrote to Sean Rhodes, and we personalized it. Every decision that you make is how are we going to make his life easier or her life easier, whatever the case may be. If you look at the types of personas that are your customers, here's some. They may not apply to everyone in the room. A SOC analyst is one of your customers. What are you going to provide to a SOC analyst? A threat hunter, David, wherever David's at. Pyramid of Pain. See, I did mention it. Kyle must not be in the room. Thank you. Thank you. The CISO is certainly a persona that you're going to be talking to. Other C-level execs, and then business line leaders. These are all potential candidates that you're delivering intelligence products to. At the SOC analyst level, what you deliver there is going to be different than what you deliver to the CISO. This actually goes back to what Cliff was talking about on telling a story. The way you tell a story to a SOC analyst is very different than the way you tell a story to a business leader. For each persona, and this is a shorter example of it, you want to understand them better so that you can meet their needs and have them buy into you and what you're trying to accomplish. So understanding their motivations, what motivates a person, how are they incented? This is really, really important because people work towards what they're incented on. So if you can hook in to some way that this person makes money or their review gets better, it's really good to have. The reporting structure, who do they report up to and who reports to them? And also, how do you support both sides of that? Their skills, and this is really important as far as kind of tailoring the technical message. Are they technical? Then it's okay to talk to them about IOCs and reverse engineering and things like that. If they're not technical, that's the surest way to have somebody shut down and never want to talk to you again. Do they come from the intelligence community? If not, I wouldn't be using terms like PIR and all these other acronyms that those of us from the IC love to use. You will also shut them down. Understanding their business acumen. If you start talking to them about business risk, they may not be at the level where they're interested in that. Although I would argue, and you've heard me say this for those that have been here in the past, you really need to understand what the business risks are to your organization, be it an agency or a private sector commercial type of group, because everyone has a role in trying to understand that risk in their own world. The SOC analyst needs to have an understanding of the overall business risk. So using those personas, at the end of my deck, I actually have a link to this, but there's an infographic from a marketing site that has, it's really long, on different things that you could do to build out personas for your intelligence customers. If you have marketing people in your own organization, be it you're a vendor on the security side, or if you are consumer facing, I would talk to them. They are no doubt building personas because it's how you effectively sell, and maybe you can leverage them. And again, you're also getting out of the little bubble that we often work in IT or cyber or threat intelligence. Dossiers. So the Hitler analysis that was done, right, was a dossier on Hitler. You can build dossiers, not to say your management is like that at all. It's not the best transition, probably. But build dossiers on, you don't have a persona for everyone in the organization that's an Intel customer. Then for your very strategic people that you want to influence, that you need to get budget from, you need to get the buy-in for whatever your program's goal is, build a dossier on them. It is tailored to an individual. What are their triggers? Becca and I were talking about this yesterday. At Rapid7, they know not to use the word feed with her because her face turns red, she starts to become a gunny again, starts yelling at them, dressing them down. When I was an analyst at Forrester, one of the early things I did was actionable intelligence. It drives me absolutely crazy. So for these very key people that you want to influence, understand their triggers and then avoid them, right? The reverse of that is, what are they passionate about? What can you hook into to get their interest? I did a blog on this. I was talking, it was about a month ago, or it was related to Donald Trump, and how could the IC prepare intelligence products to get him to buy into it. So this is where a lot of this persona and dossier stuff came from. But what are they interested in? What gets their attention? And then I would start off all my conversations with them with what gets their attention, and then document it. This actually ties back to what Cliff was saying before as well. Just like you would document things in an investigation, You need to be documenting these interactions that you're having with these individuals and also include what your strategic goal is for that person. I think you'll have a much more receptive audience if you can have this kind of strategy. So I was going to run through 5 ways to connect. So first, personas for all roles that are your customers, dossiers for specific individuals, but then you have to connect with them. First is use your terminology. Use their terminology, not yours, which I kind of alluded to, right? No PIRs for someone that doesn't even know what intelligence is. Next is focus on what they care about. I kind of alluded to that on the previous slide. A personal story. And I think when I work with CISOs at Forrester, or I work with them now, we always try to tell a story. Actually, Becca, a good, interesting story for, throwing you out, you're my straw man, I guess, was around fraud in e-commerce. And it was coupon. Was it coupon fraud? Is that what it was? This example there, and then being able to take something that's a risk to the business, use examples about maybe how this has happened to competitors or peer group people, maybe talk about how threat actors are targeting it, and you weave this story together, but at the foundation is what they care about. And it's all about storytelling, right? It's not giving them a stupid, very technical report, that sort of thing. Figure out how to tell the story to that individual. And then be flexible. Just like incident response, if you think back maybe 3 years ago, feel free to argue this. We didn't have playbooks. I think the 1%ers had playbooks how they're going to do incident response. But whose playbook for IR is just this path, and I can only go up and down this path? Nope, I got to stay on target. Imagine if you're getting tech support from a call center that's overseas, and they have their script, and they can't deviate from that script at all. Just like in IR, we need to be able to go up and down the rows. We need to have flexibility built in. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of scenario for your intelligence customers. So you got to be flexible to what's going to work with them, what's going to resonate with them. And then engage with them outside of work. Now, lately I've been trying to work in barbecue into all my talks, and I thought this was a good example. If you come to Texas and you wanted to engage with someone, you take them out to barbecue. This would be burnt ends. How many people have had burnt ends? I think I've said this many times, but I think pound for pound, it's the best bite of any meat that you can possibly have. They're delicious. So what you could do if you're trying to influence people is take them out to lunch, right? Completely separate of the occasion that you would have for your, if you're doing a quarterly threat brief for the executive team. Get a champion. A really good way to do is to get a champion and focus on one person, have them be your champion, and then they can start telling you, when you're building out personas, you do interviews. You do lots of interviews, internal, external, things like that. But get someone to be your champion, and that will be very, very helpful to your overall goal. Operation North Pole. Anybody familiar with this one? So this is one I thought was pretty interesting. So the Netherlands was occupied by Germany, just like France was occupied by Germany. And they're just like the OSS was operating in France, looking to subvert German interests. They're trying to do the same thing in the Netherlands, except this time it was SOE, so it was the British that were trying to do this. This is one of the more interesting counterintelligence stories of World War II, and it speaks to a lot of the confusion around intel. It speaks to that intel is not definitive. At worst case, it's a best guess, and then you may have certain, we think this is 50% good assessment, 75%. This individual was in the German military intelligence. And this was an interesting one because they actually cooperated with the SD, which is very rare. But basically what happened was with Major Giskus running CI, trying to detect espionage agents operating in the Netherlands, Mr. Lauwers. So Mr. Lauwers and a colleague airdropped in the middle of the night into the Netherlands. And his goal was to set up a lot of like what they were doing with Operation Torch, have a radio, operate out of an attic someplace, transmit strength, troop disposition, that sort of thing. At this time, we didn't know where the invasion was going to be. It hadn't been settled yet. But unfortunately for him, he wound up with 2 double agents, and he got captured by German intelligence, a combination of the SD and Abwehr. And it was a brilliant move from Germany's side, is they basically had this individual start transmitting like everything is good to go, nothing to see here. And there's a little bit of controversy in this story, and I'll get to that. But when these radio men were doing their transmissions, they had these fail-safes built in. so they could indicate if they were under duress or not. Well, he put his security, he left his security check out to indicate that he was under duress, but it was missed. It was missed, and I'll go a little bit more into that story next. What ended up happening over a 2-year span of time is that 90 RAF sorties were flown. 54 Dutch SOE agents were killed, and 83 RAF crew died, because essentially what they would do was say, everything's good to go, we're going to insert another team, and then they would land, and German intelligence was right there, the CI teams, and they would arrest them. So they did this with great effect. So great that they got 500,000 guilders in this time. They also got US dollars and French francs. 53 radio sets. This will become important in a second, too, as I dig into this as well. Over 4,000 machine guns. 50,000 rounds of ammunition. I said machine guns, but they also got pistols, they got rifles, they got everything. They got so much the Germans had to have a warehouse just to store all of this gear. Parachute in, arrest them, have trucks ready to go, take all of their gear. Those radio sets were quite heavy. They had different models of them, but they were not the easiest to use. And ultimately what ended up happening was there was a seminary in the Netherlands that was a prison, and some of the Dutch soldiers escaped, and they made their way back to the UK. And finally, for whatever reason, between those members coming back to the UK and the continued security check being omitted, they realized that this was blown, and so they weren't going to send any more. So as a last laugh, Major Giscas here was a troll, and trolling happens today, and happened back then quite a bit too. This is what he sent. On April Fool's Day, I guess it was 42, April Fool's Day, from 12 different radio sets, he sent this message all at the same time. And essentially, send more people, we'll treat them with the same care that we treated the other 54 agents that we killed, and then that officially ended this operation. It's quite interesting because a lot of the things that we see in this do apply to today. I actually found these books. I didn't have a chance to read them as I was doing the research, but Major Giscas actually wrote a book here. And I actually want to read, this is on my reading list now to check this out, but there's a lot of controversy around this. And I think it actually ties back to some of the controversy that we have around attribution that we're doing now. And I think some of this will actually kind of cue up Brian and Juan's talk tomorrow when they dig into some of the challenges associated with attribution. But here, there's all these theories about what was happening. One was that SOE was inept, and they were very much butting heads with MI6. I'll talk more about that. Another one was that a German agent working for SOE was saying, nothing to see here, move along, and they purposely left out these checks. We're not really certain. There was a fire, and all the documents were lost. Perhaps this is sitting in a basement somewhere in GCHQ, because there was another theory that the British were doing this on purpose to make the Germans think the invasion was going to happen in the Netherlands. So there's all this confusion and conjecture. There was investigations after the war. So it reminds me a lot of some of the stories that you have with intelligence failures in general, but then also some of the things that are going on attribution for us now. A couple lessons learned here. Don't let rivalries impact analysis. So SOE and MI6 did not get along, and one of the other kind of theories was they were so inept they didn't want anyone to know about it so that they would look bad. If you think about us in the commercial sector, we have a lot of rivalries in our own teams where analysts disagree. It's actually good for analysts to disagree if you're doing it in the right way, because you're having different opinions and you can come up with a better assessment if you don't have groupthink. But unfortunately, as you start to go a little bit bigger beyond organizations, you see analysts disagreeing across different organizations or competitors, which then leads to this. This has been one of the most irritating things, I think, for me, and I know a lot of others as well, if you look past over the past 4 months in the elections, is sometimes I think we're 2-year-olds in this space. We talk about how far we've come in our assessments. This is an indicator of how far we have to go, because we get wrapped up in poo-pooing all over someone's assessment without ever even seeing any of the data that they made their assessment on. Talk about triggers. This would be a good trigger for me. Like my heart rate just went up. My blood pressure just spiked. We need to get rid of this drama, and unfortunately, we haven't. Structured analysis techniques. Now, SOE was a newer organization. They didn't have the history that MI6 had. Maybe if they had another group of analysts looking at the same, Sergio has talked about this, you have 2 different sets of analysts reviewing it, blind to each other, they don't know about it, and see what assessment comes up. Maybe SOE could have done more structured analysis techniques to minimize what happened with those security checks that were omitted. This could be a whole talk, and I know there's other talks that are going to be happening over the next 2 days on structured analysis techniques, so I won't dig into it more. I do have a reference to this. It's actually a CIA doc. It talks about 8 or 9 different structured analysis techniques. I think the one most people are familiar with now that don't come out of the IC is probably ACH, alternate computing hypotheses. Actually, our most popular blog at Digital Shadows last year was on the Tesco breach, on an ACH on that. I know Threat Connect has done stuff on ACH, so we see that. I'd like to see us as a community on the practitioner side and the vendor side starting to do more other types of structured analysis techniques with a real-world example so that someone who isn't familiar with it can take it and understand, start to do this in your own organization. And you can do SATs without slowing down your process. You determine what type of SAT you do for what type of question you're trying to answer. So you don't have to think, oh my God, I don't have time to do ACH. You don't always have to do that. This is something that in one of the Slack groups I'm in, and I know some people in this room have taken it. It's a free class. It's a MOOC course on analysis. A lot of times people don't have money. So here's a free course that you could go do. If you go a little bit further, here's an example for me in Dallas. Southern Methodist University actually has a certificate course. It's a week-long kind of a boot camp type of thing. But in this area, I know there's a lot of options. There's online options as well. This is not a bad thing to work into, for your teams. And I know I try to do this with my team. Actually, I've got a person here right on my team. They got to come here as part of their annual, plan. Building this kind of stuff into your training. I know we've already done our 2017 budgeting, but it helps with retention, and it's hard enough to retain people as it is. And you don't want to spend 2 or 3 years grooming someone and then have them leave for reasons like, I want to get better training, I want to go to 1 course a year. I don't think that's unreasonable. So building that sort of stuff in, I think, is really helpful. To summarize, everything I think for me goes back to strategic purpose. And I've been talking about this in many different ways at probably not the first year. The first year was really indicator focused for me. But as the time go on, I see that still is a big gap for us. Klopp and I were talking about it last night. So understand the strategic purpose of your organization and align to it. Personas, dossiers, and connecting. That is how you, and it probably sets up some of Christian's talk. I don't know where Christian's at, because Christian's got to talk tomorrow, right, on intelligence reports and how to write good reporting and things like that. So some of this stuff feeds in quite well to that. The rivalries we already talked about. Let's try to minimize that, minimize the drama, and then start building structured analysis techniques. You could have your own teams. One of the things that we do is we'll do a presentation on a different technique that we applied someplace, and then we'll go public with it later. But try to have, maybe that's, each month or each quarter, your intel teams are looking at a particular problem you have, applying a SAT to it, and then presenting it to the organization as a takeaway for it. And then I end with Wild Bill again, because he is such an interesting person, just crazy individual, but he did so much. And like I say, CIA, JSOC, I don't know that a lot of time's gone by, perhaps they would still exist, but he did a lot of interesting things with respect to that. And this is actually, and I linked to this volume in here, but this is a letter he wrote to FDR, leading into this volume on the type of work that they did. And it's very interesting. I think if you look at this, which I have this on the next piece, these are the volume 1 report for Washington organization, and then the OSS operations in the field. They're very interesting reads. They're not really long. You could look through it. You might be able to find some things you could adopt to your own programs or language around that. And so everything that I've referenced here, you got this as a takeaway. So you want to look at the personas, they're here. The 3 books that I read, 1 book on Wild Bill and then 2 books on German intelligence are here.